There's a statistic that should make every Canadian under 40 stop and stare. In 1976, a single person working full-time at minimum wage could afford the average Canadian home in about 7 years. Today, that same minimum wage worker would need to save every single dollar they earn for 25 years to afford the same home. But here's the part that should terrify you. Even if you're not making minimum wage, even if you're a software engineer pulling in 6 figures or a nurse with a decade of experience, the math still doesn't work. Because somewhere between 1976 and now, Canada stopped treating housing like shelter and started treating it like a retirement plan. Today, we're going to look at the mechanism that's turning an entire generation into permanent renters and why the people who designed this system have no incentive to fix it. Let's start with a number that gets thrown around a lot but rarely explained. The ownership rate? In 2011, roughly 69% of Canadian households owned their homes. By 2021, that number had dropped to about 66%. That might not sound dramatic, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of families who slipped out of ownership and into renting, and the trend is accelerating. But the real story isn't in the national average. It's in the cities where jobs actually exist. In Toronto, home ownership among people under 35 has collapsed from about 55% in the 1990s to under 30% today. In Vancouver, it's even worse. We're watching an entire generation get locked out in real time. Here's what that means in practice. Imagine you're 28 years old. You did everything right. You've got a degree. You've landed a decent job. You make $75,000 a year, which sounds like a lot until you do the math. The down payment is where the math becomes truly impossible. The average home price in Toronto is about $1.1 million. Even if you stretch and go for a condo, you're looking at $700,000 minimum for something that isn't falling apart. The standard down payment is 20%, which means you need $140,000 in cash. If you're saving 10% of your after-tax income, which most financial experts say is aggressive, you're putting away $5,500 a year. At that rate, it would take you 25 years to save the down payment. But here's the trap. While you're saving, housing prices are rising faster than you can save. Every year, the goalpost moves further away. You're running on a treadmill that's speeding up. This creates what economists call a two-tier system, but that's too polite. What we really have is a modern feudal structure. If your parents own a home, they can leverage that equity. They can consign your mortgage. They can gift you $50,000 or $100,000 for a down payment. You enter the ownership class. If your parents rent, you're starting from zero. And zero in today's market means you're probably staying at zero. The bank of mom and dad has become the single biggest predictor of whether you'll ever own property in Canada. We've turned intergenerational wealth into a birthright system. But let's talk about who benefits from this arrangement. There's a class of Canadians, mostly over the age of 55, who bought homes when they were affordable. A 3-bedroom house in Leslieville or Kitsilano that cost $200,000 in 1995 is now worth $1.8 million. That homeowner didn't work harder. They didn't innovate. They just bought at the right time. And now they're re-sitting on tax-free capital gains that dwarf anything they could have earned through actual labor. The system has created a class of accidental millionaires whose wealth is entirely tied to the value of their property staying high or going higher. This is where the incentive structure breaks down. These homeowners vote. They show up to city council meetings, and they fight, tooth and nail, against anything that might increase housing supply. Every new apartment building is met with concerns about parking, about shadows, about neighborhood character. What they really mean is, we don't want our property values to go down. They've pulled up the ladder, and they're defending the castle. And you can't even really blame them as individuals. If your entire retirement plan is based on selling your house for $2 million, you're going to protect that asset. The system has aligned their interests against the interests of the young. Now, the government will tell you they're trying to fix this. They'll point to first-time homebuyer programs, 2 tax credits, 2 shared equity schemes. But these programs are like putting a Band-Aid on a severed artery. The first-time homebuyer incentive lets you borrow up to 10% of your down payment from the government. Sounds helpful until you realize that in a city where homes cost $1 million, that's $100,000 you have to pay back eventually. It doesn't solve the affordability problem. It just lets you take on more debt. The real solution, the one nobody wants to say out loud, is that housing prices need to fall. Not slowly. Not gradually. They need to crash by 30, 40, maybe 50% in the major cities. That's the only way the math starts working again for people who don't have wealthy parents. But the government can't let that happen. Housing and construction represent about 20% of Canada's GDP. If housing crashes, the banks become insolvent because they're holding trillions in mortgage debt. The pension funds collapse because they're heavily invested in real estate. The entire economy unravels. So instead, we get this zombie policy where the government pretends to care about affordability while doing everything possible to keep prices propped up. There's another mechanism at work here that doesn't get enough attention: financialization. In the last decade, institutional investors, private equity firms, and real estate investment trusts have moved into the Canadian housing market in a big way. They're not buying homes to live in. They're buying homes as assets. They're buying entire apartment buildings, converting them to condos, and flipping them. They're buying pre-construction units in bulk and sitting on them. This isn't some conspiracy theory. You can look at the data. In some Canadian cities, up to 20% of recent condo purchases are by investors, not people who plan to live there. What this means is that you're not just competing with other families for housing. You're competing with Bay Street firms that have billions in capital and can pay cash. They don't care if the rent is too high for a normal person. They're playing a different game. They're betting that Canadian housing will continue to be a safe, appreciating asset. And as long as the government keeps immigration high and housing supply low, they're right. Let's talk about what it actually feels like to be a permanent renter in Canada. There's the financial stress, obviously. But there's also the psychological toll. You can't paint the walls, you can't get a dog. You unmake any long-term plans because your landlord can decide to sell or rent-evict you with a few months' notice. You always one bad inspection away from losing your rent-controlled unit and having your monthly payment jump by $500. This creates a low-grade anxiety that never goes away. You're never settled. You're never home in the full sense of the word. And then there's the future you're not building. Homeownership has always been the primary wealth-building tool for the middle class. You pay down a mortgage and eventually you own an asset. Renters build nothing. Every dollar you pay in rent is gone forever. It's building your landlord's equity, not yours. Over a 30-year period, the difference between renting and owning is easily $500,000 to $1 million in wealth. We're watching an entire generation get shut out of wealth accumulation. They'll retire with nothing but their CPP and whatever they manage to scrape together in RRSPs. The fertility crisis is tied directly to this. Canada's birth rate has fallen to 1.33 children per woman, well below the replacement rate of 2.1. When you ask young Canadians why they're not having kids, housing comes up again and again. You can't raise a family in a one-bedroom apartment. You can't afford childcare and rent. You can't take the financial risk of going down to one income when you're already stretched to the breaking point. We are literally pricing ourselves out of existence as a society. Here's where it gets darker. The government knows all of this. They have economists. They have data. They understand that the current path is unsustainable, but they're trapped by a political reality. Homeowners are 66% of the population. Renters are 34%. Homeowners vote at much higher rates, especially older homeowners. If a politician ran on a platform of crashing housing prices to make homes affordable, they would lose in a landslide. The majority of Canadians would vote against their own children's future because they couldn't afford to take the financial hit. This is the trap. Democracy is failing because the majority has a vested interest in maintaining a system that's killing the minority. So what happens next? There are a few possible futures. One is that we just accept this. Canada becomes a nation of renters. Ownership becomes a luxury for the top 20%. We normalize multi-generational housing, not out of cultural preference, but out of economic necessity. Adult children live with their parents into their 30s and 40s because there's no other option. This is already happening. The percentage of young adults living with their parents has skyrocketed. Another future is the brain drain accelerates. If you're a talented engineer or doctor or tradesperson, why would you stay in Canada? You can move to the United States and buy a house in Texas or North Carolina for half the price while earning double the salary. The best and the brightest leave. Canada is left with the old, the indebted, and the people who couldn't afford to leave. The tax base shrinks. The debt spirals. We become a cautionary tale. The third future, the one that requires political courage nobody seems to have, is that we actually fix this. We flood the market with supply by rezoning every single-family neighborhood in Toronto and Vancouver for mid-rise apartments. We tax speculative investors out of the market. We build social housing on a scale we haven't seen since the 1970s. We tell homeowners that their property values are going to fall, and that's the price of saving the country. But I'm not holding my breath. If you're watching this and you're under 40 and you rent, I want you to understand something. You're not failing. You're not bad with money. You're not lazy. You're replaying a game where the rules were rewritten in the middle of the match by people who already won. The system is designed to extract wealth from your generation and transfer it to the generation that came before. That's not a metaphor. That's math. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to keep playing a rigged game, or are you going to make a different choice? Some of you will leave. Some of you will fight for policy change. Some of you will find a way to make it work. But whatever you do, don't let anyone tell you that this is normal. Don't let anyone tell you that this is just how things are. This is a choice. A series of choices made by politicians and voters and investors over decades. And choices can be unmade. Let me know in the comments if you're renting or if you've managed to buy and what that experience has been like. And if you want more videos breaking down the economic systems that are quietly shaping your life, hit that subscribe button, because this conversation is just getting started.